Senator, we have a question online from Steve that he was wondering about your reform agenda. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Steve, I've been working for the last few years to try to develop a series of affirmative, proactive policy reforms that would harness the principles of limited government, the principles of the Constitution in such a way as to benefit America's poor and middle class. What we've seen over the last few years is that America's poor and middle class are getting squeezed by an increasingly big, overbearing national government, one that doesn't really regard the little guy, one that doesn't really pay attention to Main Street nearly as much as it does to Wall Street in New York or K Street here in Washington. So I've been working on a series of step-by-step incremental reforms that would improve everything from higher education to primary and secondary education to transportation infrastructure funding, and do so by means of making Washington a less intrusive presence. It's also something that would reform our criminal justice system and includes a proposal that would eliminate penalties in our tax code that adversely affect so many Utah families. Things like the parent tax penalty and the marriage tax penalty in the tax code. So one of the many examples I can point to is my Higher Education Reform Act, one that would allow states to have the flexibility of creating their own alternative higher education accreditation bodies. If they had the authority to do that, then people could have access to federal financial aid for higher education experiences. And they could use that for newer, more innovative higher education learning experiences, things like massive open online courses or MOOCs. Certain types of vocational training programs would be eligible to participate. Perhaps most importantly, this system would help end the iron triangle that exists in our current higher education system. An iron triangle between the traditional higher education learning experience and traditional provider, the U.S. Department of Education, and the accrediting bodies that are recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. What we would do is if we allowed states to accredit institutions or providers of massive open online courses or vocational training programs, we would increase the supply of higher education experience providers. When you increase the supply of something, you tend to increase competition. When you increase competition, quality goes up and the price tends to go down. I've also got a major reform initiative for our transportation infrastructure funding mechanism. Currently, the federal government collects 18.4 cents for every gallon of gasoline that you buy at the pump. It takes that to Washington, it runs it through Washington's filter, and then it spits it back out according to a formula developed by the federal government. The problem with that is that this gasoline tax was created for one purpose. It was created for the purpose of building an interstate highway system. That system is now complete, and we could maintain that system for less than 4 cents per gallon. So what my proposal would do is to reduce the federal gasoline tax down to about 4 cents per gallon and allow the states to collect the difference. Meaning if the states want to use that money for bike trails, for hiking trails, for their own surface roads that aren't connected to or part of the interstate highway system, then they're free to do that. But we shouldn't be taking all this money to Washington, where it really does more to foster and promote the development of big government bureaucracy and key insiders within the federal government, and does relatively little to actually improve the steel and concrete going into the ground. So these are part of my efforts to make sure that we utilize the power and the strength of the federal government in a responsible way, in a way that's consistent with the principles embodied in the U.S. Constitution, and in a way that will help promote the growth of America's middle class and help the poor to get out of poverty.